You are standing in the Libyan desert, roughly 26 million years ago, though it does not matter exactly when, because this happens over and over across deep time. Lightning cracks down into the sand. For a fraction of a second, the temperature at the strike point spikes past 2,800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt the silica in the sand itself. It fuses, cools, and hardens into a long, hollow, glassy tube called a fulgurite. Nobody made this. Nature did. And it is not the only way glass shows up on Earth without human help. Volcanoes do it too, cooling lava so fast the minerals never get time to form crystals. And the result is obsidian, black volcanic glass, sharp enough to split a cell wall thinner than a surgical blade. Long before any human invented anything, glass already existed. Stone Age people picked up obsidian and immediately understood what it was for. They napped it into arrowheads and blades, so sharp that modern surgeons still occasionally use obsidian scalpels because the edge beats surgical steel. So here's the real question, not who discovered glass, because nobody discovered it, it was lying around. The question is who figured out how to make it on purpose. And the story most people know for that part is almost certainly wrong. The version everyone has heard comes from the Roman writer Pliny, the Elder. Phoenician sailors, he claimed, landed on a beach with a cargo of natron, a mineral used for cleaning and preserving, and had no stones to prop up their cooking pots. So they used blocks of natron instead. The fire got hot enough that the natron and the beach sand fused together and ran out as a strange new liquid. Glass invented by accident on a beach by hungry sailors. It is a great story. It is also almost certainly a myth, and archaeologists have known this for a while, because it would not actually work. A campfire does not get anywhere near hot enough to melt sand. And the real story, like bread, like most human technologies, is slower, older, and far less romantic than the legend. The oldest confirmed man-made glass objects are beads, and they come from Egypt and Mesopotamia, dating to somewhere around the 3rd millennium BCE, roughly 5,000 years ago, though the exact chronology has been getting revised constantly. For decades, archaeologists pointed to a site called Nuzi in what is now Iraq as Ground Zero. Glass beads and vessel, fragments pulled from the ground, almost a century ago and assumed to be among the oldest glass objects on the planet. Then in 2016, conservation scientist Catherine Ehrman at Harvard's Art Museums and archaeologist Andrew Shortland at Cranfield University reanalyzed those objects. Some, it turned out, were only a few hundred years old. The genuinely oldest pieces from that site dated to about 3,400 years ago, not the deep antiquity everyone had assumed. Their research pointed toward Egypt, not Mesopotamia, as the more likely place where deliberate glassmaking first took hold, though the debate is still active and unresolved. What is not in dispute is the deeper pattern. Simple glazes, essentially glass in liquid form applied to pottery and stone, show up even earlier than solid glass objects, meaning humans were fusing silica with a flux for thousands of years, before anyone thought to pour that same molten material into a mold and let it cool into a standalone object. And that brings us to the actual hard problem, the one that took millennia to solve. Pure sand silica melts at around 1,700 degrees Celsius. No ancient kiln on Earth could reach that temperature. So how did Bronze Age people make glass at all? The answer is a flux, a substance that lowers the melting point dramatically. Natron, the same mineral from the Pliny myth, or ash from burned plants rich in sodium and potassium mixed with crushed quartz, could bring the working temperature down to somewhere around 900 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. Add a stabilizer, usually lime, and you get something that will not dissolve back into powder the moment it touches water. 3 ingredients, roughly silica, flux, stabilizer, and a furnace hot enough to hold that middle temperature for hours. Miss the ratio and you get a cloudy, brittle mess. Get it right, and the silicon and oxygen atoms cool into a tangled, disordered network, never locking into the neat repeating grid of a crystal. That is the actual definition of glass. Not a type of rock, not a mineral, but a liquid that got frozen too fast to organize itself. A solid that is secretly still arranged like a fluid. Chemists still argue about the exact physics of that transition. Now here's the reframe, because just like bread was never really about hunger at first, glass was never really about windows or drinking cups. The earliest glass, expensive, difficult, produced in tiny quantities by specialists who guarded the recipe, was a stand-in for gemstones. Deep blue glass beads were cheap lapis lazuli. Turquoise-colored glass stood in for turquoise. It was a prestige good, a luxury item for elites who wanted the look. Of precious stone without mining it out of a mountain 1,000 miles away, glass in its first few centuries of existence was not utilitarian at all. It was jewelry and status and diplomatic currency between kings. The late Bronze Age, roughly 1600 to 1200 BCE, is when this luxury industry really took off, in Egypt and Mycenaean Greece, and across Mesopotamia. And the trade networks moving this stuff are almost hard to believe. The Uluburun shipwreck, a merchant vessel that sank off the coast of Turkey in the 14th century BCE, was found loaded with raw glass ingots meant to be melted down and reworked somewhere else entirely. In 2014, archaeologist Jeanette Varberg of the Mosgard Museum in Denmark published chemical analysis of glass beads pulled from Danish bronze, age graves, and traced their chemical fingerprints straight back to workshops in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Denmark, more than 5,000 kilometers from where the glass was made. A Bronze Age Danish chieftain buried with beads that had started their journey in a pharaoh's workshop on the Nile. That is how badly people wanted this material, and how far they were willing to move it. For roughly 2,000 years, glass stayed a hand-shaped luxury good, formed by a technique called core forming, where a craftsman built a rough core out of mud and dung on the end of a metal rod, dipped it repeatedly into molten glass, trailed on decorative threads of color, and then, once it cooled, scraped the core out from the inside, leaving a small hollow. Vessel, slow, skilled, expensive. And then, sometime around the middle of the 1st century BCE, somewhere along the Syro-Palestinian coast, someone changed everything with a single idea. Instead of dipping a solid core into glass, what if you gathered a blob of molten glass on the end of a hollow tube and blew into it? Archaeological finds from sites like Tel Anafa in the Levant show the shift happening. Almost overnight in historical terms, thin-walled blown vessels appearing where only thick, laboriously core-formed ones existed before. Nobody recorded the exact moment or the person who did it. But the effect was immediate and enormous. A glass vessel that used to take a skilled artisan the better part of a day to core form could now be blown in minutes. Glass stopped being a rare luxury reserved for the wealthy and became, within a couple of generations, something an ordinary Roman citizen might own. The geographer Strabo, writing under Emperor Augustus, described the price of a Roman drinking cup as roughly the cost of a single copper coin. That is the speed of the transformation, from Bronze Age treasure traded across thousands of kilometers, to something you could buy for pocket change in a Roman market in the span of a few decades. Rome ran with it. Glass windows started appearing in wealthy villas. Glass mosaic tiles covered bathhouse ceilings. When Vesuvius buried Pompeii in 79 AD, it preserved the same kind of everyday glassware. Cups, bottles, perfume flasks, that ordinary Roman. Households used without a second thought. An object that 4 centuries earlier would have been fit for a king's tomb. Now, like bread, this technology had a body count nobody talks about enough. Glass blowing meant working inches from a furnace, running at over 1,000 degrees Celsius, for hours in workshops with no ventilation. Silicosis, chronic lung disease from inhaling fine mineral dust, was an occupational reality for glassworkers for most of history, and it still is in some traditional workshops today. Burns were constant, and by the medieval period, when Venice turned glassmaking into a state industry, the human cost took a different, stranger shape. In 1291, Venetian authorities ordered every glass furnace in the city relocated to the island of Murano, officially because the furnaces were a fire risk in a city built largely of wood, but historians generally agree the real motive was control. Murano's glassmakers became a state secret. Their techniques for producing clear, colorless glass, called cristallo, were treated the way a modern government treats classified weapons technology. Glassmakers were forbidden by law from leaving the Venetian Republic. Those who tried to defect and sell their knowledge abroad were, according to the historical record, hunted down and in some cases killed. Master glassmakers lived comfortable, even privileged lives, married into noble families in some cases. But they were, in a very real sense, trapped by their own expertise. A skill valuable enough to build an empire's reputation on was also valuable enough to be worth killing over. And just like bread, glassmaking was never a single invention that spread outward from one point. It converged. In Mesoamerica, the Aztec and earlier cultures ground obsidian into mirrors, polished so precisely they could show a clear reflection used in divination. Rituals long before Europeans arrived with glass mirrors of their own. In China, glassmaking developed independently, producing eye beads and small ornaments with a distinct chemical recipe using lead and barium, instead of the natron-based formulas of the Mediterranean world. In the Islamic world, after the technique spread through Syria and Egypt, glassmakers in the medieval period pushed the craft further than anyone, developing luster painting, enameled mosque lamps, techniques so advanced that European glassmakers spent centuries trying to reverse engineer them. Every culture that got its hands on silica, heat, and a flux eventually arrived at some version of the same idea because, like grinding grain, the problem was universal and the physics did not care where you lived. And then glass did something bread never did. It changed how humans see literally. By the 13th century, glassmakers in Italy were grinding curved lenses and mounting them in frames, creating the first eyeglasses. Suddenly, scholars, monks, and merchants whose eyesight had failed them in middle age. Exactly the point in a career when experience makes you most valuable. Could keep reading and keep working. Historians have argued this quietly extended the productive careers of scribes and scholars. Right as movable type printing was about to flood Europe with books worth reading, 2 centuries later, someone, likely in the Netherlands, discovered that lining up 2 lenses in a tube did something extraordinary. It magnified. Point that tube at the sky and a Dutch spectacle maker's toy became, in the hands of a stubborn Italian mathematician named Galileo, the instrument that revealed Jupiter had moons and the Milky Way was made of countless individual stars, evidence that helped tear apart 1,000 years of assumptions about humanity's place in the universe. Turn the same idea toward the impossibly small instead of the impossibly large, and you get the microscope, and suddenly a Dutch draper named Antony van Leeuwenhoek is peering at a drop of pond water and discovering an entire invisible world of microorganisms that nobody on Earth had ever known existed. None of that happens without glass. Not medicine, not astronomy, not the scientific revolution as we understand it. All of it routed through a material that started its life as a fake gemstone for Bronze Age nobles who just wanted to look wealthy. And the language remembers this too, the way it remembered bread. The word crystal, now used loosely for any transparent glass, originally meant something entirely different. Ice so cold and pure the ancient Greeks believed it could never melt back into water. Krystallos, mirrors once. People could finally afford to look at a clear, accurate reflection of their own face rather than a dim smear in polished metal, are credited by some historians with quietly reshaping how people in Renaissance Europe thought about the individual self. Portraiture, personal identity, vanity as a concept worth painting. Stained glass windows turned churches into machines for filtering ordinary sunlight into something that felt holy. Colored light as a deliberate theological argument without a single word spoken. A technology born from a lightning strike in the desert ended up building telescopes, eyeglasses, and cathedral windows. And somewhere in a Dutch workshop in the late 1500s, someone was about to point 2 of those lenses at each other and change what the human eye could see forever.